Welcome to Counterpoint Generations. I'm Counterpoint editor Zafar Sobhan. I'm joined by my father, Professor Rehman Sobhan, and we are here post-election. There's an awful lot to discuss, as always. In recent days, we've had our election finally on February the 12th, and then we have now, in fact, had the cabinet identified and the members of parliament sworn in. So let's start at the start. Let's start with the election. What are your thoughts? How did it go? As expected, or were you surprised pleasantly or unpleasantly?
Well, I think as elections go, it went well. In comparison to the last three elections we witnessed without a caretaker government, it is a great improvement. It was a competitive election. In fact, the measure of a competitive election is that the winner remains unpredictable, more or less, all the way to the finishing post. This was not the case in the last three elections. So this is a great advance, and people were in the mood for a competitive election without fear of any serious violence actually taking place. So these were the plus points. And the fact that the elections went off peacefully, I mean, there have been complaints, particularly from the opposition, the losers, the Jamaat and the NCP, about issues relating to poll counts and so forth. And in fact, they are aiming to file a complaint.
But they're fairly muted complaints.
But on the whole, that even the complaints, if taken into account, are not going to really make much of a difference to the end result of the election. So that the election delivered a fair result, and we are now prepared for the regime which is now going to emerge out of that, which has credibility and legitimacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing which we have learned, though of course, to a large extent is something we already knew, is that there is a night and day difference, at least in Bangladesh, between elections which are held by a non-party government, be it an interim government or a caretaker government, and those which are held by a political government. In fact, when you have a election held by an interim government, a non-political government, there's no reason to believe that it's not going to be above board and free and fair. And it's just, all of the imperatives which you see with a political government aren't there. And so I think we forgot about that because, of course, the last neutral administration we had was back in 2008. But this kind of reminded us of, of how it had been. And it had been for 4 elections in a row, if I'm not wrong, more or less. I mean, we can leave out the February 1996 election, which doesn't really count. But and yeah, they went very well. I think people in our neck of the woods were a little bit more concerned that the Jamaat would do better than I think people who were looking at polls nationwide were expecting. But the interesting thing here is that, of course, typically what happens is that whoever wins the election, if you look at any election in Bangladesh's history, they generally sweep Dhaka, you see. And what happened, it's anomalous here, is that BNP, of course, won a good majority, 50% of the vote, roughly 2/3 of the seats. But they didn't win all of Dhaka. There were a number of seats which went to the Jamaat, which is very unusual. And that is why perhaps when people look at how people in Dhaka city were seeing how well Jamaat were doing, usually that extrapolates to a very good nationwide performance. So the difference here was that it didn't quite translate. But if you look at even Dhaka 17, I mean, Tariq Rahman won by 4,000 votes. It was actually very close.
Gave them a good fight, and obviously there was a big difference between what was going on in the Gulshan Model School, which seems to be the voting point of the tri-state elite, and what was going on in Korail Basti, which was meant to be...
Well, of course, we're assuming that that's where Khalid got all of his votes, and then Tariq got all of his votes in Gulshan Model, and
well, we'll have to see the breakdown.
But I'm quite interested in whether that's actually the case.
I don't know how quickly they will give us access to the polling by center.
Yeah, but that's what I would like to actually see, which polling centers and how people performed in either one. And, we don't really have granular polling data, but you can extrapolate based on the center quite a bit.
Well,
But
you
one of the
actually do
things,
have data for the individual polling centers.
yeah,
The only
and you
trouble
have.
is you don't have analysts with the capacity to reach out to that and to then
No,
do their
we do.
sums.
We do. But I mean, the thing is you can, like I said, you're going to have to extrapolate who's voting where. So, for instance, the other thing is, again, uh, women voters against versus men voters. Again, we
Yeah.
don't actually have that. You usually have exit polls. So, Netro News did an exit poll with they asked about 1,600 voters, which is not a great deal, but it's enough to go on. But one of the things they found was that it wasn't as though women necessarily voted disproportionately for the BNP and men for the Jamaat. They didn't find any evidence of that, so that's interesting.
No, well, I think that was quite expected because the Jamaat was playing a strong game in a door-to-door campaign where women,
That's right.
workers of the Jamaat, were reaching out to women voters.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, we read about it periodically, but it was obviously a very well-organized game.
Yeah.
And it paid off.
We have this very good piece in the last issue of Counterpoint. I'm not sure if you read it. But it's basically, he said that this gentleman, he points out just how much better the Jamaat had done compared to their previous showing.
Yes.
And it's absolutely true. I mean, there were, and I talked to the gentleman earlier today, and he wants to update his piece because we now have more sort of information. So he said that there's about, well, here, what did we write? We wrote that there was, we wrote that there was, I think, 5 seats where it was between the majority was less than 5,000, and then there are another 18 seats. No, there were 9 seats where it was less than 5,000. Another 18 seats where it was below 10,000. And he points out that if you take it up to 15,000, there were 100 seats where the majority was below 15,000. There were not that many where it was actually a blowout. So it's a very interesting finding.
Good. So they've essentially doubled their vote share and have now assumed their place as the missing third party in Bangladesh politics, because we had lived for a long time under the binomial presence of the Awami League and the BNP, and the consequences that followed from that. Now we have a genuine major third party out there.
Well, I mean, also a fourth party.
Competing with them.
The NCP, I think, overperformed. I mean, I
don't buy that at all.
Okay.
I noticed that was one of your takeaways, but I don't think people need more decisive evidence.
Do you think it was basically they got Jamaat votes?
I would think that they very significantly got Jamaat votes.
That could be.
I mean, what they would have managed to do had they contested the elections on their own, it would have been a good test case to find out whether there was a genuine youth constituency and they could coalesce around the NCP. But basically, the Jamaat came out in full force. And they played a genuine role as a coalition partner in supporting candidates who they had sponsored from outside the party.
And that's the thing, because of course, oftentimes in Bangladeshi politics, that's not the case. I think there's at least one. There are probably several BNP alliance candidates who did not win, or independent candidates who were supported ostensibly by the BNP, but precisely because the BNP local workers in that area did not, in fact, campaign for them.
Well, it went in a way that they divided the vote. I thought that in many cases the independent BNP rebel candidates would do better, but they only managed to win. How many seats did they win?
I'm not sure. It's about a half dozen or so.
But more to the point, they lost a number of seats for the BNP by their presence. Where the BNP would have won it had there been no rebel candidate.
So they split the vote and it went to Jamaat or NCP.
So anyway, the difference was that the Jamaat ran a much more disciplined party. The BNP did much better in disciplining their party than we had expected.
Well, the other point I also made in one of my 10 takeaways when I said that, there's good news for everyone. There was actually good news for the Awami League as well, because they couldn't take part. They were barred from participating. But it's very clear, if you look at the results, that they then retain a significant support base within the country. You see, since the total vote was only 60%, I mean, that
Yeah, I think
suggests.
about another 20% would be Awami League voters who stayed home.
Yeah,
And then there would be a certain percentage who very consciously
would have voted
voted for the
probably for the
BNP.
BNP, yeah.
Actually, a good measure of what might be an Awami League vote is the no vote for the referendum. Because there's no reason why the BNP people would actually vote no. They may not vote. And
Yeah.
I mean, there were a number of no voters in the referendum, which would probably be BNP people.
Yeah.
But if they had to vote, there was no reason why they should not vote yes.
Yeah.
So if anyone was voting no, it would be a very deliberate decision.
Yeah.
And the only political force which would be making such a deliberate decision, I would imagine, would be the Awami League supporters.
Well, that is interesting, and I think that's something which you can actually look, if we look at, various voting centres and we look at how the vote came out, and then we look at the no vote, we can certainly extrapolate some information. I know, for instance, no vote, for instance, did very well in places like Gopalganj. So you had people coming out, and they didn't actually vote in the election, but they voted no on the referendum, and presumably those would be Awami Leaguers.
So there are ways in which we can
find this out. Yeah.
Yes, we can work that out.
Yeah, so it's going to be very interesting, and of course, then we have to then see after the elections whether what steps are taken to reintegrate them into the political firmament. So this is one of the big questions which is going to await Tariq Rahman. He's going to have these big decisions to make. That's one of them. Another big decision is to what is he going to do with all of these legal cases. And my understanding is they're going to let them run their course, which means that a vast majority of people who are behind bars right now will be released on bail. And many other people, for instance, have cases against them, but they don't have arrest warrants, but they're underground because they're concerned that they could be arrested at any time. But since these cases really don't have any evidence against them, that's something which people will now, they'll either return to the country, or if they're in the country but underground, or to some extent, they will now become more visible.
Well, one of the first decisions, I think, which Tariq will have to make is whether he is willing to restore the country to the rule of law.
Yeah, well, that's what he said. I mean, they asked him, what are you going to do?
Yunus did not manage to do that, sadly. Whether he is going to do that, and whether, in fact, the court will let due process play out, that people will not be arrested without proper charges, they will not be held
at his press
without
conference,
bail.
He was asked, what are you going to do for the Awami League? Okay, and he said, and I thought it was a good answer. He said, and they said, how are you going to reach out to them? He said, I will establish rule of law. And I think that's a good answer.
That is a very important question of his interpretation of the rule of law. I mean, if it actually means that he will now let independent judicial process
that's
play
the impression
itself
out.
Then that will be measured again in terms of the consequences which he will face then, when a lot of people who had hitherto for the last 18 months, been out of the land.
Well, now I hear the interim government, now their position is, and we've got a lot of indications of this, but people didn't really go out on record and say it to the same extent. But now when I talk to people who are in the government or close to the government, they say, look, the problem was that the law enforcement in the army were never really under our control. And so this is why we couldn't really deliver on the law and order front. One thing which will change is, I think, with a political government, an elected government, that will very squarely be under the within their power. And now we have Salahuddin has been
but on the first question, I would
you don't buy it?
Buy it. I think all those who were behind bars, the interim government intended for them to stay behind bars. And if they had really wanted the rule of law to play itself out, it would not have taken a great jurist to work
So you
out
don't
how
buy
to do
that,
that. No, so
that
I
defense.
absolutely do not buy that.
Mm.
So at the end of the day, it will be up to the intention of the government in power, in this case now Tariq in the BNP.
What do you think of Salahuddin as the Home Minister? He is, and again, I talk to people who are close to the party, and they say he's by some distance the most capable person they have.
Well, again, much will depend on
And he, of course,
whether
has
he will
Tariq's
again
confidence.
be willing to enforce the law as Home Minister in a neutral and objective way. He should basically go back and look at the records of Operation Clean Heart.
Sure.
Because Operation Clean Heart was initiated by Begum Khalida Zia in 2000, just about a year or so after they were elected, because crime was running amok, and a lot of it was being carried out by party people,
their own people. In fact,
that's right. So then, when they deployed the army to participate in Clean Heart, a lot of the victims then turned out to be party people, and with approaching local government elections, they had to then call off Clean Heart. So now, essentially, if you are going to apply yourself with objectivity, then you will have to be ready to deal harshly with your own party people. I think that one of the main sources of the breakdown of the rule of law was the fact that you had dual interpretation of the law, and you had this one-eyed justice at work, in which all the crimes committed by the ruling party were then absolved, and this gave them a free hand to do whatever they wanted to do, because they knew that they would never be at risk of being held accountable for their crimes.
Sure. Okay, on that note, let's take a quick break. We've hit our 15-minute mark, but we'll be back again very shortly just after this. We're back, in the next appointment in the cabinet I want to talk about is, I think, the only other one which has raised eyebrows and is actually quite interesting, is the appointment of Dr. Khalil as the foreign minister, as a technocrat foreign minister. What are your thoughts on that? I think it is quite a surprise to most of us.
Well, I think the most immediate surprise on that would be that this must have been something which would have been in the works for quite some time.
Apparently since the London trip, in fact.
Well, I don't know about when that began, but obviously he would be very much within their sights. And in the event that that possibility was there, then the sensible thing would have been for him to step out of the caretaker of the interim government, and then identify himself more closely with the BNP, which would have been a perfectly normal thing to do.
Right, and of course, in the caretaker governments of past, this would not have been possible. There was actually a regulation in place that no caretaker government official could serve in a subsequent political government.
That is correct, and I think that applied to the caretaker government. These people presumably were thinking that they are somehow different from a caretaker government, and concluded from that the old rules do not apply. But the principle remains the same, that someone who is involved in ushering in a competitive election should not be in a position to take sides in the election process. And he would be taking sides if he is already identified with a particular party during the election period. So there is a problem. But I think the other more substantive issue which is there is how actively he is going to be engaged in taking the regime, the new government, down a particular strategic gateway. I think the agreement which he negotiated and put on the table, and I think he was the full-time entrepreneur in that exercise, of the agreement with the US government, had a certain sort of clearly marked identity associated with it. And to have done an exercise of that nature just on the eve of an election, and to then saddle an incoming government with all the responsibilities which go with it. I mean, that was really quite inappropriate.
But presumably the BNP has no problem with this, right?
Well, from the looks of it now, in the event that he is now taken over as the foreign minister of the BNP, this would then not have come as a surprise to the BNP, and so
they
obviously
were consulted throughout the process, if I'm not wrong.
And so they obviously were perfectly comfortable with this.
Yeah.
So the argument then that here you have a situation in which incoming government was saddled with a set of agreements which they had not really been looking at may not be correct. They may already be there.
But the counter argument, compared to the caretaker government situation, is that, of course, the classic caretaker government we had had a tenure for 3 months, starting from 1991 and moving on. The argument could be made that with an interim government, now presumably this is precisely the argument they do make, is that with an interim government, there is a significant benefit from allowing one or more people from the interim government to stay on if the new government is interested, because that provides you with continuity. Because otherwise, when you have an interim government which is there for a year and a half, there may be too much of a rupture in between political governments. And so this is probably the role which Khalil will play, not just when it comes to the US trade deal, but just in general to help smooth the transition. It's useful to have someone like that there. I mean, I'm guessing that's part of the understanding.
It could be, and in the event that he was going to play that role, I presume he would then have been keeping the BNP informed, so that the trade deal may well have the concurrence of the BNP.
And we'll find out.
I haven't seen so far anyone from the BNP making any complaints about it, comments about it.
What do you think about the other issues such as LGD graduation, which I think the BNP has today indicated that
this narrative has been going on surely from Awami League times.
Yeah.
Where when we actually did graduate, we celebrated this and with great pride claimed that we had made these very remarkable advances which have enabled us to graduate out of the ghetto of the LDCs.
Yeah.
But once that date started approaching, then the export lobby, and particularly the RMG lobby, then became hyperactive and started wanting to defer this. Now, the graduation has already been deferred.
Yes.
Because, in fact, we do not graduate at the end of 2026. We graduate at the end of 2029. So all the duty benefits and things which we are getting as a consequence of being an LDC continue for another 3 years.
Yes.
So I think the hype of wanting to basically extend 3 years into 6 or 9 years for graduation doesn't speak very highly of the self-confidence and competitive capacities of our major export houses.
Yeah, so I think that's clearly the case. I mean, they would argue, I think, that they have many problems in terms of the business environment here, for instance, which make it difficult for them to be competitive. But
well, like I said, I don't know whether the environment is worse than Pakistan's. Oh, it's worse than Sri Lanka's, who are all graduated out of the LDC ghetto.
Yeah.
And 3 years is a pretty good time to get your act together.
And especially as it's been brewing for the best part of a decade.
But the relevant point in any case is not discussing the merits or demerits of this case, but that already certain ground rules prevail in the graduation process. And merely to accommodate a country of 170 million people who many had argued shouldn't have been classified as an LDC in the first place,
yes.
To then accommodate them to stay on for another 9 years. After all, you are not the Maldives, or you're not some sort of Pacific island country with 150,000 people. So in those circumstances, we will have to see how the UN system reacts and how the people who actually will end up voting on this in the General Assembly, where the final decisions will be taken.
They may not.
Yeah, you will need to develop some very exceptional reasons to persuade them. I mean, on the face of it, you have graduated, and you cannot turn what was then seen as a meritorious act into liability, which you then want to unburden yourself from that liability, just because it is inconvenient for you.
No, that's a fair point. Of course, the interesting thing is, again, this brings us to the new cabinet. So Amir Khosrow is the new finance minister, which is, I think, not a surprise. I mean, I think he was the front runner for that position. Interestingly, I noticed that they have bundled finance and planning together, which is something which in recent, for a long time now, possibly always.
No, not always. They've had periods in which planning and finance.
So what's the significance of keeping them separate or keeping them together rather than separate?
Well, I think usually you do that when you are wanting to reduce the size of the cabinet. I mean, these tend to be the planning portfolio is really not a very substantive portfolio. It has no real executive responsibilities. I mean, when we originally set up the planning ministry, one of the big functions which was assigned to it was that the External Resources Division was responsible for aid negotiations and for the programming of foreign aid.
Yeah.
That part has been removed from the control of the Planning Commission and has remained for many years with the Finance Ministry.
Yeah.
So as of now, the Planning Ministry is a pretty powerless entity. And its role in terms of policy making is very much determined by the relationship between the finance minister and the planning minister. I mean, the planning minister invariably functions as the sort of the younger brother of the planning ministry rather than an equal.
It makes sense to have them both combined into one portfolio. The interesting thing is, of course, how these personalities are going to play. Because Amir Khosrow is it's a well-known businessman, and his economic views are fairly well known. But the state minister for finance and planning is Junaid Saki, and of course the economic advisor to the PM is Mr. Rashid Titumir. So there's going to be an interesting, I think, interplay between these three people.
Well, I think the relevant interplay will be between Titumir and the finance minister.
Yeah.
Because the Prime Minister's Secretariat in the Hasina regime was the dominant center for power, and she had a whole bunch of advisors, including an advisor for finance, which was Rehman.
That's right.
Who exercised a lot of weight. Now, in the time when Mohit was the finance minister and was a powerful person in his own right, the locus of power was retained. Well, I wouldn't say it was retained by Mohit, because any ministry can coexist. The prime minister was always interested in what was going on in finance, and used her advisors to then keep watch on it. But when you had a bunch of people like Lotus Kamal and others who were completely dysfunctional, then for all practical purposes, economic policy making was relocated in the Prime Minister's Secretariat, and the advisors then became disproportionately powerful.
How did it work?
We'll have to see how the dialectic works.
But how did it work when you had Moshir and Mohit both? I mean, how did they manage to coexist with one another?
No, because Mohit had been a senior civil servant, and Moshir Rehman had served as an officer under Mohit.
I see.
So
that gave him
in terms of the sort of hierarchical nature of the relationship, he would never get into a situation where he would want to override Mohit, unless the Prime Minister herself wanted to override the Finance
Sure.
Minister, which happened quite often.
Okay, yeah, but of course, in that sense, then one would figure that then Khosrow would outrank Titu Mir.
Well, completely, but I think Titu Mir would obviously need to use the leverage of the Prime Minister himself
Sure.
if there were particular issues he wanted to. But I think, given the senior position of Khosrow in the party, there is no doubt that the locus of influence will be in the ministry. And I think because Junaid Saki, I think, has only a nodding acquaintance with the issues of finance. I'm sure he's a smart guy and can learn. But he would very much have to function as a subordinate of the finance minister.
Sure.
And would have to deal with whatever responsibilities are assigned to him by the minister. He has no autonomous space as a
he's never
state
served
minister
in
to express
government.
himself.
Yeah, he's never served in government before.
I mean,
This is,
because
very
a similar
new, yeah.
situation existed, I remember, when I think Mohit was the finance minister and Mannan was the state minister. So Mannan was a pretty anonymous person in that particular period.
Sure.
It was only when he then became the planning minister
yeah.
and he had a completely dysfunctional finance minister
Yeah.
that he became more visible.
Yeah, yeah. What do you make of Abdullah Al-Minto as the environment minister? That's an interesting.
Well, everyone thought that he would either be the agricultural minister or the industries minister.
Yeah.
Whether this is his choice and whether he has privately fancied himself as a person who will solve Bangladesh's environmental problems, he has a great deal of sort of self-confidence. I do not know, and whether he then sought out this portfolio.
I've heard people suggest that in this day and age, you see, that it's actually a much more important ministry than people would think, because, of course...
Well, the ministry is very important, depending on how seriously you want to apply your mind to it. Whether Mintu wanted to do that and whether he felt he had any competitive advantage in taking on environment over industries or agriculture, because he has a very great
I had
interest
understood
in
that agriculture was what his
yes,
interest
that
was.
he was spending a lot of his time in trying to develop seeds which were sort of suitable to the sort of agroclimate of Bangladesh.
It's a big part of his business. I think one thing which we may see, of course, is that the last government, we had Sabir Hussain, who was in fact for climate change, and so if that portfolio is tied in to the environmental portfolio, I think there were two ministers now. I don't think there's a separate climate change person.
Yeah, it would be the same thing. But Sabir was a very committed person to issues of climate change and had also developed quite a bit of expertise in it. Whether Mintu has done that in his spare time, I do not know.
That I don't know either, but one suspects perhaps he has.
Yeah, but he's a smart guy and a good can-do type of person. So if he really sets his mind to doing something about the environment, I'm sure he can then do something.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, on that note, we're a bit out of time. Sometimes I think maybe we should make these 1 hour instead of 30 minutes. So who knows?
I have no problem if you want to do that.
Yeah, well, like I said, we won't start it today because we both have places we need to be. But I wonder if we'd be taxing the patience of our audience. But it's something to think about, because I often feel that we have to cut these conversations off. Well, you should premature.
You should do a sort of program creep and move from 30 minutes to 40
and then
see whether you get any sort of complaints from the
that's not a bad idea.
Audience.
That's not a bad idea. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much for tuning in. We'll be back next week. As things in Bangladesh develop on the ground, there's always plenty to talk about, and we'll be here to talk about it. Thank you very much.